All right, so general liability, where does it stop and where does errors and omissions kick in? So basic general liability, people, I'm assuming most of you know what this is, but GL basically covers bodily injury and property damage, typically covers personal advertising injury, and products and completed ops. Pretty basic on almost every GL form. Some GL forms, probably most, will give you coverage for the following things: slip and fall, property damage to others' property, that libel and slander. Now, the key here is being libel and slander as a result of the organization's communications, not necessarily while providing professional services, and we can talk about that a little bit as we move on. The actual sales of goods or damages to damages to premises rented, very commonly covered on GL forms. What might be covered are the following: abuse and molestation, and that will depend. Sometimes you'll see exclusions for that, so you got to be really careful. Sometimes you'll see sublimits. You just need to be really careful about that exposure. Every once in a while, you'll see errors and omissions within the general liability form or as an endorsement. You got to be real careful with that. A lot of times it's bare bones and doesn't provide the E&O coverage that you need. Sometimes you'll see hired non-owned. Sometimes you'll see coverage for off-premise operations and activities, like special events. You'll have some liquor liability, things like that. That's pretty common. They might be covered on the GL form, they might not. But here's what's not covered on a GL form a lot: automobile exposures, workers' comp, liquor, pollution, EPL, and data breach. And there's definitely other webinars out there to talk about EPL coverage and as well as the data breach cyber coverage. There are whole other disciplines. So what you need to be careful of, I mentioned certain exclusions. You need to be careful, and you need to look for these things on your GL forms. The abuse and molestation exclusion, this really comes into play when you're working with kids, whether it's a tutor, a teacher, an educational consultant, things along those lines which may have access to children and may want coverage for true abuse and molestation allegations. A lot of times you'll see carriers limit GL to premise-only coverage. Sometimes that makes sense, maybe if you're just working within an office, but sometimes it really doesn't, especially if you're a consultant and you're going from place to place. Sometimes there'll be limitations, called a classification limitation endorsement. That will simply limit coverage for certain things. So you may have GL coverage, but you may not have GL coverage for a few of the activities that you're involved with. And the most important one, and a lot of times you're going to see this, is a professional services exclusion. And when you see that, that means that anything that's considered a professional service, and these are things that we're going to talk about in a few moments, is not covered by the GL form. So bottom line is, if you're providing a professional service, do not rely on a GL form to provide coverage. You really need to consider a professional liability form. The standard ISO business form contains a professional exclusion, absolutely.